Hello everyone, and welcome to our final video discussing our analysis of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So again, remember, make sure you are watching the videos in order. Otherwise, all of this analysis is not going to make any sense. And do make sure that you have also downloaded a copy of the worksheet to go along with today's video. We're going to begin then first with making sure we understood what is being discussed on a comprehension level. So we see here that our narrator is in the midst of contemplating what the raven really means by the word nevermore. Remember, he's pulled up his chair right in front of the bird where it's sitting on that bust of the goddess Athena. And as he's thinking and sitting in that chair, he recalls the loss of his lover Lenore and thinking about how there are things in life that she will never get to do again, like he's doing, for example, by sitting in that chair. And as he's pondering this, he begins to feel the air around him change and thicken and become scented. And he uses a lot of imagery that's reminiscent of heaven. And so he begins to shout at the raven and really calling him and begging him, please give me something, anything, a potion to help me forget my memories of Lenore. And the raven replies, nevermore, implying that he will never be rid of the sadness that he feels. So in anger for this reply, the narrator continues to shout at the bird, calling him a prophet, something that's evil or a devil, and even claiming that the bird was sent either by this evil power, a tempter, or this storm, a tempest. And he again pleads with the raven. He asks him for a balm, then something to soothe him and to heal him from these memories that he has. And again, the raven replies, nevermore, again implying that the narrator will never be free of his sorrow. The next thing I do is I look again at my rhyme scheme, and I see that my pattern again continues, and that my internal rhyme in this first stanza on this slide continues as well, with guessing, expressing, and diving, reclining. I look then to my second stanza on this page, and I see this internal rhyme continue, denser with censor and lent and scent. Then I'm going to turn to the last stanza on this page, and I see that here my internal rhyme has broken. And again, I need to remember that whenever I see this break in a pattern, that the narrator, and by extension then the poet, is trying to tell me something. So here, evil and devil, we might say perhaps that's a slant rhyme going on, but undaunted and enchanted definitely don't rhyme with one another, those words in verse 3. So I see then that this break is highlighting the fact that we see an extreme shift or change in the attitude of the narrator, and he begins yelling and shouting and basically claiming that this bird, not even being sent from heaven then, is in fact sent from hell, and begging and pleading to be rid of his memories of his lost lover. So looking then at my summary, I see this continuation of the plot, with finally building up to the climax, this moment when my narrator is going to realize that he will never be rid of the memories that he has of Lenore. I then continue to see that my rhyme scheme, and by extension also, right, my meter, because I'm looking at that as well, continues, that this free-flowing rhythmic feel to the poem still is in place, and that Poe again uses that break in internal rhyme to help highlight this moment in the narration for me, but also that these verses continue to form trochaic octameter, that stressed unstressed pattern that makes me feel ill at ease, again keeping with the dark and mysterious overall mood and tone of the poem. I'm going to do the same thing then with my final three stanzas. And here I then see that he is going to continue to ask the raven for some sign of hope. Okay, maybe I can't rid myself of my memories of her, but at least tell me if in death, when I go to heaven, will I be able to once again even just hold the hand of my lover? And the raven replies, nevermore, either implying that he, Poe himself, will not enter heaven, or that Lenore, his lover, whom he puts in this imagery of heaven and angels, is perhaps maybe not even in heaven at all. And so this, rightfully so, sends our narrator into a rage against the raven, and he continues to shout, telling him, go back to hell where you came from. Remember, Night's Plutonian shore then being an allusion to hell, and here the raven replies, nevermore, meaning that just like you will never be rid of your memories of your dead lover, you will never be rid of me. So the poem then ends with this dark and haunting feel. And we see this continuing in the final stanza. Some time later, we're not really given an exact timing, the narrator tells us that the raven is still sitting in that same spot. And the shadow that he casts upon the floor, now the narrator says, is where his soul is forced to lie, that his soul is going to be caked in this shadow, in this darkness forever, right? Never more to rise again to hope. So ending really in a dramatic and depressing way. And this tone then standing in contrast to the rhythmic feel that's given through the rhyme scheme. Remember, that's something we talked about throughout the poem, that there's this great contrast between the way the rhyme scheme and the internal rhyme help to create this light, free-flowing feel, but yet the fact that the meter creates in us this tension. It goes against that natural beat of human speech. And also the very subject being discussed goes against those happy feelings that the rhyme scheme and the internal rhyme give off. We see that internal rhyme repeating itself, right, in all of the stanzas that we see here. So again, here we see the pivotal moment where the raven reminds or really condemns the narrator to a life full of misery. And we see that in the falling action and finally resolution, that the narrator has come to accept this misery that he now lives in, and that he will forever be plagued by the memories of Lenore, but also plagued by the raven himself. Again, we also talked about how that rhyme scheme and meter work together to create that contrast and really to enhance the tension that we should be feeling throughout the entirety of the poem. This tension between the almost fairy tale-like feel of the way the words sound, but then the haunting, dark, and terrifying meter and subject being discussed. So just some analytical takeaways simply for the form. We continue to see that it follows the pattern of a narrative poem, so it does tell a story, one where we see the central conflict coming to a head, that conflict initially right on the outside with the raven and the narrator, but also the narrator with himself. This idea that he is never able to let go of the misery and the pain that he feels. And then finally coming to a resolution by the end of the poem where we realize that he's going to be stuck and trapped in this state of misery forever. And that's how he comes to a solution to the conflict of never being rid of his feelings for Lenore. And through this, we're able to clearly see the theme of the poem, this idea that memory and loss are inescapable, and that we can never truly rid ourselves of the sorrow that we feel. So not a very uplifting theme, but the theme nonetheless. And this theme is brought together, right, by that rhyme scheme. So the consistent, almost fairy tale-like rhyme and then the internal rhyme that work together to stand in contrast to the very subject of the poem itself. And how the narrator is going to use breaks in that internal rhyme to draw attention to moments of climax or extreme importance in the poem. And then finally, our discussion of meter, how Poe consistently uses trochaic octameter, so 8 feet of that trochaic meter, the stressed and unstressed, and how we classify this as falling meter, meaning it begins stressed and ends unstressed, and that this stands in the opposites of iambic meter, meaning that if iambic meter then classifies our natural pattern of speech, trochaic meter goes against all of that. Now we're coming to literary devices, and again, we're going to look first at sound devices and note that Poe makes excellent use of sound devices throughout the poem. And part of the reason why he does this, right, remember, is to enhance that fairy tale-like rhythmic feel that the rhyme scheme produces. And we see some examples here again of alliteration, that initial repetition of the first letter. It can be either that consonant or vowel. Okay, so for example, burned into my bosom, the repetition of the letter B, tinkled on the tuffeted floor, that initial repetition of the letter T. And again, you see another repetition of the letter T in the final stanza on this slide, tempest tossed thee. We also see that Poe continues to make use of assonance, so that repetition of a vowel sound that takes place anywhere in a word. So foul whose, so that O sound being repeated, but also fiery eyes, that I sound being repeated. You see the I sound being repeated again in the middle stanza, I cried. And finally, whether tempter sent, that E sound being repeated. And finally, a few examples of consonants, which is the repetition in the middle or the end of a word of a consonant. So violet, velvet, violet, the repetition of that T sound. And again, you hear that same repetition in that middle stanza, forget this lost. And then we're going to turn to our figurative language examples. And we see that, again, Poe continues to create image that is not only dark and terrifying, but now we see this battle between heavenly imagery and hellish imagery. So, for example, when we talk about those words such as seraphim in that middle stanza, that being another word for an angel. And so how the narrator is talking about the room changing, almost as if these unseen angels are swinging these perfume censers. If anyone's ever been to a mass service, a censer would be the object that would carry this perfume, and that people would swing back and forth down the aisles to permeate the room with this smell. And so we have those almost heavenly angelic images immediately contrasted with very dark and hellish ones. For example, he straight out calls the bird a devil, something evil, by horror haunted. So this again is going to also enhance the own turmoil within the narrator, is questioning this whole entire time, where does this bird come from? Is he sent in fact by God, or is he sent by something more dark and sinister? And we realize, because of the way the raven repeats that word nevermore, and how in each stanza that word takes on new and darker meaning, we see by the end of the poem that the narrator was right to think that this bird is in fact coming from a darker place. Speaking of our raven, we also begin to see more examples of personification, that a reminder that the raven is very much a character in this poem. But not just the raven is personified, but remember, there are even things in the very room with our narrator that are also personified. So the room itself is coming to light, or to life. So for example, in that first stanza, when Poe and the narrator are saying that this lamplight gloated o'er, to gloat, right, to hold something over someone, to mock, to be happy in someone's misery, or to boast about your own higher position. And so here the narrator is saying that as he sat on this cushion, not only is this raven speaking to him and mocking him, but even the light that shines down on the narrator mocks him as well. We also see another example of illusion. And here we're going to see this take place in the very last stanza on this page. And here the narrator is asking, is there any balm in Gilead? And a balm, for example, think of lip balm that you would put on if your lips are very chapped in the winter or in the summer. And it has a healing effect, this healing quality. And when we talk about this illusion, we're referring to a place in the Bible where balm of Gilead is referred to as having this magical healing power, and specifically being able to heal from sorrow and misery. So it's very powerful that Poe alludes to this balm in particular. We also continue to see repetition. Again, the repetition in the beginning, right, of this quoth the raven nevermore. Now each time this repeating of that word nevermore takes on new meaning. And here in both of these stanzas, the raven is saying that there is nothing that will be able to cleanse you from the memory of your dead lover. So now this word nevermore taking on a mocking and really haunting feeling. And then we move into our last three stanzas for the poem, and we continue to see a plethora of sound devices like alliteration, assonance, and consonants, and how all of these work together to, again, highlight that rhythmic feeling to the poem that stands in direct contrast to the subject matter and the dark and tension-creating meter. We also see imagery continue to unfold, and that this imagery now is turning very much so towards the dark and mysterious and supernatural. And this is in large part due to the fact that in this section in particular, the narrator is going to realize that this bird does in fact come from hell. And we see that through the use of certain words. For example, tempest. So here in this middle stanza, the narrator is shouting to the raven, go back to the storm that you came from, to night's Plutonian shore, to hell, right? And we also see the continued use of personification, this time not just in reference to the raven, but also to his soul, saying that the very soul within him is burdened down by sorrow. So it's not just something that he as a human feels, but he personifies the soul within him and says, my sorrow is so deep that even my soul can feel it there. And we see that this sorrow is a direct result of this absence of his lover. And in a last final ditch attempt to rid himself of the sorrowful memories of Lenore, he asks the raven, and here we see illusion being used. He asks, in this distant Aden, will I be able to hold her again? And Aden, if you think about it for a moment, looks and sounds very similar to a place mentioned in the Bible. If you are thinking of the Garden of Eden, you are correct. So here, Poe is asking, is she in Eden? Is she in paradise? And if so, will I get to see her there? And so when we see then this repetition later of the nevermore response used here, that this repetition now takes on that dual meaning, either of you will never make it to heaven and hence will be departed from her forever, or she in fact is not there. So both of these being very depressing and dark. And we also see a continued allusion to hell in that middle stanza, when our narrator is shouting for the raven to go back to night's Plutonian shore. Remember, Pluto being the Roman name for the Greek god Hades, the king of hell. And then finally, another Greek reference with the use of Pallas as an epithet or another name for the Greek goddess Athena, this goddess of wisdom. And finally, we'll finish up with repetition. So we see the use of repetition again taking on this dark atmosphere, right? When the raven is repeating nevermore here, saying, one, that you will never be reunited with her. But then in this middle stanza, not only will you never see her again, but you will never be rid of me. So again, ending on this very dark and haunting tone. So just some final takeaways from our overall reading of The Raven. So this poem is one in particular, a great example of sound devices, and Poe makes excellent use of them, not only to create a consistent rhythmic sound, but again to have that free-flowing feel that also takes on that melancholic or sorrowful tone. We also see the continued use of figurative language, how the imagery is used to not only display the tension that exists within the narrator as he's trying to figure out where this bird comes from, but also ultimately showing the sorrow that he's trapped with. We also see personification being used so that the character of the raven really becomes a main figure, a human-like figure within the poem, someone that we, like the narrator, cannot ignore. And again, the extreme importance of the use of repetition in this poem to enhance the dark and melancholic feeling of the whole narrative, and how the repetition of this word nevermore takes on a new meaning almost with every new stanza, and how it guides the narrator and us as the reader through the story into finally understanding that the narrator will never have peace. And then this reflects itself again in the tone and then the mood of the poem. So the tone is going to end very sorrowfully and pitifully as the narrator accepts this eternal state of sorrow that he's going to be trapped in. And also ending with a mood that is depressing because we, like the narrator, finally come to understand that sorrow can never be gotten rid of. It will always stay with us. So that's going to be it for unit number 3 on poetry. I really do hope you've enjoyed The Raven. It's one of my personal favorites and an excellent poem to use to practice your knowledge of poetry. Speaking of which, I'm going to post a short quiz as a link on lesson for this Friday or next Friday, April 10th. So please on Friday, April 10th, go ahead and click on the link that I will put on agenda. It's just going to be a few multiple choice and true and false questions. It won't take you more than 10 minutes. Obviously, you're at home, so you can have your notes in front of you, and your notes are really going to be all that you need. And this is just to make sure that you do have your knowledge of poetry down, because we are not leaving poetry behind. You will need to make sure that you have a firm and solid grasp of poetry and its characteristics, because we're going to need it in part when we move on to our next unit. That's it for today's video. In our video for next time, I'm going to introduce our new unit, unit number 4, which will be drama, the good kind. So for those of you who were loving Shakespearean sonnets and you come to find that you're missing them, hopefully that's at least some of you, because his writing is brilliant. Do not fear. We are going to once again discuss Shakespeare, this time looking at one of his famous tragedy plays, Julius Caesar. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.